The first thing Mara heard was the crash, wood splintering like a shout, and then a man's laugh that sounded too close to thunder for the remoteness of her ridge. She had her hand on the rigged lantern before her heart finished the sentence of terror, the single bulb throwing her breath into rigid ghosts. Someone had kicked the door inward. Someone had come for what they thought a mountain woman would hide: pills, relics, a box of money. The cabin smelled of boiled spruce and the last of summer's smoked venison. Now it carried the sour tang of human breath and the cold metal of guns rubbing leather. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Tomas Cod moved like a man used to getting what he wanted. He ducked into the doorway with 3 others behind him, lean shadows in the dim, their boots still bright with the wet of descending trails. He wore a coat too thin for the mountain, and a face that had been carved by late nights, bad trades, and promises he'd meant to keep but never could. His eyes went straight to Mara, not in the polite way of a town gentleman, but in the hungry, cataloging way of someone who counted possibilities like currency. "You alone?" he asked. His voice was low, a practiced balance of command and curiosity. Mara's answer was a small, steady refusal. "I'm alone," she said. The words left her without apology. She had been alone for longer than most people measured time. The ridge taught you solitude unless you were kin or treaty-bound. She kept the old ways as one keeps a wound, tended, secret, a part of the body that refused to die. She smelled the men immediately: smoke, stale beer, the hidden metal of city lives. Her palms were steady. She had learned to braid fear into routines, bolts, traps, the slow safety of places only she knew how to move through. Tomas laughed, the laugh of a man who believed in leverage. His men spread around the small cabin like birds testing branches, their hands roaming surfaces, eyes skimming jars, jars of seeds lying side by side in the cupboard like relics. One of them pried at a wooden box under the bed. Mara's jaw tightened when he found the photograph, an old, curled thing tucked beneath wool. Her grandmother, thin and luminous, standing with a colossal print in the snow at her feet. The bandit's laugh sharpened into want. "You keep family heirlooms and pills alike, princess," Tomas said, flipping the photo with a casual cruelty. He didn't know how wrong he was, how manifold the heirlooms were, how the things Mara guarded were less about value and more about covenant. He saw opportunity where she kept duty. The Sasquatch watched from the tree line like a legend caught in the wrong light. He was not a beast to Mara more than she was a savage to him. He was a named thing, the Omul Paduri to the elders, but to her he was more particular, Mar, as children sometimes slurred his name in the lullabies. He moved like a memory, deliberate, huge, every step a silence that belonged only to the forest's own pulse. He had been drawn by the sound of a language he recognized, human panic and the scent of strangers making promises to take. He stayed in the shadow of pines, partly because he was bound by the pact that had been sown into the land, partly because Mara needed him and she had told him by touch and soft offerings that she would always be the one who could see him and keep him unnamed. Inside, Tomas turned the cabin into a theater of small cruelties. "Out with the pills, woman," he ordered, as if a stash of pharmaceuticals could explain the photograph or the jars of seeds labeled in looping script that smelled faintly of cedar and rain. "We clear houses for folks like you. We keep the highway dry." The word "we" hung in the room like a promise of damage. One of his men, a younger figure with a crooked nose, muttered about quick money, but Tomas silenced him with a look. Mara kept her hands where he could see them. Her grandmother's voice lived in the hollow between her ribs. Teachings about the pact, about the way humans and the wood met in silence rather than demand. The seeds in the jar were not a commodity, they were a lineage. If the bandits took them, they could sell the rare bulbs, the old grains that hadn't been on market lists since her grandmother's era, or they could hand them to traders who would turn them into breedless cash. Worse, they would expose where the pact had been kept, and then men with other kinds of money, the kind that maps and digs and photographs, would come. Tomas knelt by the stove as if the warmth could answer the cold growing between him and Mara. He was not a man of simple venality. He had a bruise of tenderness in him, carefully wrapped, the result of debts owed to a woman and a child he had left in a city that forgot him. That memory made him softer in brief, unfortunate ways, a crack that had made him a good liar and a good leader of desperate men, a man who believed the world was a ledger to rearrange. He had thought the cabin would be a waypoint, shelter, supplies, and gone. The photograph and the jars made the plans rearrange in his mind. There was curiosity now, the same as greed. "You think you're protecting something?" he asked, voice lower, testing. "We can make this quick. You sign a thing, we move on. You give us the seeds, the boxes, and we let you stay." The offer was a lie and a test. He wanted the power to compel her, to watch her bend and confirm that human fragility had its price. Mara's gaze stayed on the photograph. The paw print in the snow was a map she could read like a palm. Her grandmother's chin lifted in a way the photo had preserved, the wind in the background made into a white smear. She felt her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "You don't take covenants," she said softly. "You don't know what promises are for." Her voice carried the slide of mountain vowels, a language of rocks and riverbeds. She felt small then, the cabin a thin skin between the wild and the men who thought they could re-skin the world. "Save me the sermon," Tomas said, but something in his jaw made the words lose their edge. He stepped closer in a way that smelled like an apology and a calculation both. "You got something else in that cabin, maybe. A note from someone who paid you off. Maybe you kept a surprise." The idea that human secrets could be pried open the way you peel bark off a tree is what men like him believed. He smiled because he thought it would disarm her. Outside, a pine shifted. The Sasquatch inhaled a human too close and exhaled a warning the way wind moves a curtain. He had watched village children lay offerings at the boundary stones, a teaspoon of honey, a braid of hair, and old sweater caught on a branch. In exchange, the forest had kept its hunters from human markets. Mara's grandmother had walked with him once, palms thick with sage, and placed her final signature on a paper that smelled of ash and thyme. It had been enough to bind him to the mountain, not as slavery, but as partner. Now the binding hummed underfoot like a buried current, waking. One of Tomas' men, the younger one with the crooked nose, found a small tin in the corner. Letters, a child's toy, a scrap of cloth with a number embroidered on it. He laughed like he had found treasure. "What's this, boss? Some city keepsake?" He waved the scrap. His hand was the errand of his hunger. The sound was a small bell. Mara's throat closed. The scrap was from a child's mitten, the one she'd found frozen in a ditch years back and buried under the cairn where her grandmother taught infants to leave first offerings. It was personal in the only way that mattered to her, a memory of a family that had not been able to be more than a ghost to her ridge. She thought of the child who had left the mitten or lost it on a road sign she didn't know, and it made her feel the old, desperate urge to protect what was impossible to replace. From the tree line, the giant shifted again. His fingers, hooved, tender in their callus, grazed a low branch. He did not strike, he observed. He had known humans of different kinds, hunters with greed sharp as knives, researchers who came with gentle lies and equipment, and the old ones who left bread on rocks at the edge of winter. He had tolerated them as one tolerates bright birds that sing too near a nest. But these men smelled of calculation, of a city that takes and leaves scars. The pact evaporated the moment its terms were threatened. If the covenant's keepers suffered, the guardian's temper changed. Inside, Thomas's men had begun to uncork jars and pry labels. Seeds that had been strung with threads of knowledge lay exposed to the light. Mara felt like a body opened to strangers. "You don't know what these are," she said. It was repetition, but not apology. The truth was that she didn't exactly know the qualities of each grain. What she knew was their value in ways that weren't cash, but were survival. Resilience against blight, a lineage threaded through winters. Her grandmother had taught her to read the seeds like prayer beads. "That's why we take," Thomas said. He stepped toward a jar and his fingers brushed the glass. The motion was simple, casual. It was a raid performed with the practiced grace of those who decide futures by the hour. One of his men, hungry and reckless, reached too far, tabbed too close to the edge of Mara's handmade altar where, aside from seeds, her grandmother had kept a strip of parchment folded 3 times, a document whose words were meant to be fewer than her hands. The boy's fingers trembled. The tree line tightened like a fist. The Sasquatch let out a sound not wholly animal and not fully human, a low resonance that vibrated through the ground into the men's boots. It was a remembering tone, an old word for caution. The youngest bandit froze, as if the sound had plugged his throat with ice. Tomas didn't look outside. He looked at Mara then, and, for a second, the city's soot in his face smoothed into a different expression. Recognition, like someone seeing a map that might lead them home. "What is that?" the youngest whispered. He swallowed. The question hung in the air. Outside, a branch cracked deliberately, and the mountain seemed to inhale. Mara stood very still. The house was a map of all the small things she could lose: jars, photograph, the parchment, the child's mitten. She felt the old pact tighten its threads through her fingers into the ground, and the dreadful choice unspooled ahead. Tell them and risk the world learning what had been kept? Stay silent and watch men take the seeds and the last of the lineage. She had been tested before by weather and grief and the slow forgetting of her neighbors. She had not been prepared to be tested by hunger, by the kind of greed that came from desperate cities and the men who bent themselves around debts. Outside, the Sasquatch shifted his weight and left the scent of moss and river in the air. For the first time in years, Mara felt the old fear of revelation, of the mountain's secret stepping into a world that traded in spectacle. Her hand closed on the hearth poker. She was alone with piles of meanings and a cabin full of men who had the power to unweave the pact with nothing more than a rumor and a photograph. Her choice would not be a private one. It would tear into the tissue of the mountain and show the scar. Tomas's gaze held a new calculation. He had counted leverage and found a risk that might be worth the price. He could see that the photograph was not simply sentimental. It was a key. And keys could be sold to men who loved their own kind of collecting, curators of oddities who would pay for proof that myths were real. If he used the proof, he could buy his escape. If he misused it, the mountain might turn its back on them all. He had to decide whether to exploit a woman who stood between him and the world he wanted to buy himself into, or to bargain in some older language of give and take. Mara's breath came shallow. The tree line held its giant like a hand cradling a thing that had no business being exposed. She thought of her grandmother's fingers pressing that old parchment into her palm. teaching the syllable that meant remember and keep. She had been charged with guarding not just seeds, but a way of being. Her mind, which had always favored ritual, now had to find cunning. The men needed the cabin as shelter, as stepping stone. She could sign away what she protected, or she could trust something older, a creature of senses and seasons that had once been enough. The cabin was suddenly too small for the breadth of possible futures. The bandits smelled like a storm coming down off the mountain, and so did the law that might answer men's violence. Mara could imagine deputies, boots and notches in a logbook, arriving if someone called them about the break-in. She could imagine men with cameras and nets and scientists with clever smiles. She could imagine the Sasquatch taken to rooms glazed in fluorescent light. The thought made her hands go cold. The mountain's silence felt fragile. Tomas crouched, leaning on his knees, as if to level himself to the woman whom he had come to use. The decision loomed like weather: safe exile for him and his men if he sold the secret, or a risk, perhaps nobler, perhaps ruinous, if he did not. The youngest bandit still stared at the door like a man who expects thunder to drop. Outside, the forest waited. Inside, Mara weighed the cost of a bargain that could cost the creature she had spent her life keeping invisible. She had to choose, and quickly, because men like Tomas did not linger when the ledger tilted against them. Mara could feel how short time had become, as if the mountain had folded the afternoon into a coin and tossed it between the men. Each heartbeat was a clack of stone. She thought of the pact's words not as ink, but as weather. If you break one part, the rest will change. She imagined the Sasquatch taken into a cage. She imagined the mountain learned by human tongues and losing its language. She imagined children in town pointing and asking whether monsters wore names. The pictures she had kept were not simply proof. They were a shield, a lie, and a memory shored up against want. To hand them over might buy Tomas a route out, but it would cost a life that had never asked for human eyes. Tomas' face softened for a long second that felt like a confession. "There are ways to trade without killing the thing outright," he said, a tone threaded with pragmatism and an ache that came from a man who had once promised to come back and didn't. "We could—" He stopped because his plan tasted worse out loud. The possibilities he could imagine were the same depravity that had hollowed out the city: commodify, exhibit, and make myth into money. His eyes flicked to the photograph again, to the curl of Mara's grandmother's shawl. He hadn't come to be moved, but the human capacity to pity could be a currency as potent as any. The youngest bandit cleared his throat, as though speaking might set his courage. "We could take the seeds and sell 'em easy," he said. He thought of a fast solution: small towns with hungry buyers, markets with men who didn't ask questions. He peered at Mara like a boy testing the edge of a blade. "No one'll come up here for a—" He broke off when the Sasquatch shifted like an answering presence. Outside, the creature rubbed his shoulder against the trunk of an old pine, sending a shimmer of sap into the cold air. He was ancient in the way of stones, not in age alone, but in the patience that weather bestows. He had watched winters collapse into springs, and had learned the human flex of need and the human boast of ownership. He had chosen Mara once because her grandmother had placed bread and left a braid of hair on the lowest branch of a linden. That tiny, deliberate worship had been enough to promise them to one another. Years had braided the promise into something stronger than paper. Tomas watched the tree line with a wariness that was new to him. That wariness was less about superstition than experience. He'd seen how things that seemed small could become centers of trouble. He had been a man who measured risk with numbers: debts, time on the road, bribes to be paid. But some problems resisted arithmetic. He had not expected to find himself in such a place, feeling responsible while still wanting out. It was a dangerous tenderness to harbor when men with guns watched. "Sell the seeds, then come back with money," the crooked-nosed one muttered, as if repetition could turn theft into solution. He looked at the jars the way a miser looks at coin. He was a man for whom impatience was a religion, and he could not understand that seeds had a memory a market could not buy. He reached for a jar, and the small altar trembled. Mara's hands went to her grandmother's folded parchment on instinct, as if the brittle paper could still weigh in the world. Her fingers found the fold and smoothed it, not to read, but to feel the promise. She heard her own voice beginning to speak the old words, soft syllables meant to slow whoever listened. "We hold. We keep." The cadence steadied her, but her throat felt thick as if the mountain itself had pressed something there. Tomas' men laughed then, sharp, brittle noises that were less humor than armor. They began to trade jokes about mountain superstitions, their voices cheapening the room. They drank from a rusted thermos. The city smell swelled. One of them, larger and dull-eyed, moved to the back, to the narrow stair leading to the loft where she kept winter quilts and pulses. He climbed with a casualness that made Mara's skin flare. His movement was an invasion of private elevations. Mara told herself to watch him, to mark his hands and stride and smell. Each man had a pattern, a tell. Survival in the hills was a matter of noting tells. The Sasquatch's patience thinned. He had presences to guard beside seeds, the springs that braided down the mountain like silver string, the tracks where fawns learned to leap, the cairn where Mara's grandmother had taught children to whistle for medicine. If humans thought to take what they did not understand, they would scar more than soil. The creature's throat emitted a low, mournful sound that scraped like wind over iron. It wasn't a threat yet. It was a naming. He named what he saw, intrusion. He named what he felt, betrayal. "You're trembling," Tomas said quietly, stepping a hair's breadth closer to Mara that invited surrender or fight. "I can make this not break you. We won't—" He faltered, searching for language that would not sell the creature but might protect them both. He had lived long enough to know promises could be used like knives. In his mouth, the words sounded foreign. "I can get you safe passage down the mountain, a place where they'll leave you alone." Mara's laugh was small and bitter. "Safe? I don't leave things behind to be safe, Tomas Cade." Her tone pulled his name like a cord. She had learned people's names were the only truth you could hold in debtful eyes. "This isn't about me." She did not say that the cabin felt like the only place where memory still kept its shape. She did not say how thin the line between defiance and despair had worn her. Her hands tightened on the parchment. Tomas watched that tightening, and something behind his ribs unspooled like old rope. He knew the moment. It was where a man decides whether to use his strength to take or to protect. He had used it to take before. It had gotten him places. Using it to protect had no formula. It required listening, and he had not been taught to listen. But the room's air had altered. The men in his crew were a slow tide of wanting and fear, and their hunger smelled like an inevitable storm. "You're not right to hold it alone," he said, a phrase that was equal parts accusation and plea. "Not everything got to be a burden, Mara. His voice stopped because confession made him raw. It would not be wise to give his history to a woman he had meant to push into a corner. Yet it was precisely that fracture, his abandoned son, the slip of guilt that made him taste rust, that made him hesitate to press the men to violence. There, in the pause, he understood something about power. Sometimes the brave thing was to be small. The crooked-nosed bandit scoffed, but even he paused when the huge boots outside shifted. The Sasquatch had moved now to the base of a tree, pressed his palm to the bark as one might press to another's shoulder. He was not a deity. He was an older logic of things. He did not want blood. He wanted the ways returned to their quiet. He had no language for courts or cameras or profit. He had a language of seasons and favors. But a creature's vocabulary included ferocity when the balance tipped. Someone in town might notice a cabin ransacked and call the sheriff. The very thought of deputies clawed at Mara. Deputies loved evidence, loved names they could stamp with authority. If a call were made, men in uniforms would arrive with clipboards and hard smiles, and the mountain would become a museum. She imagined the photograph enlarged and pasted to bulletin boards, the Sasquatch's face becoming proof, a ticket for men to line up. Panic flashed through her like white light. She had sworn to her grandmother to keep the pact's edges from human calendars and from the gleam of moneyed eyes. "Do you even know what he is?" Tomas asked at last, the question raw because it unmade the lie of utilitarian violence. He gestured toward the tree line as if introducing her to a neighbor. He had always been a man who needed facts to rearrange fears into plans. He wanted the thing named so he could trade for it or bargain with it or sell it. But he also wanted, in some foolish human way, the story to be simple. Mara looked at him and for the first time found the words that might hold a bargain without breaking the mountain's spine. "He is not yours to make simple," she said. She thought of the dog's eye she had once seen reflected in his pupil, like a window into time, and how that look did not belong to possession. If you want to leave this mountain, you can leave without the names. You can take the shelter and go. You can carry your guilt away in silence. Her offer was narrower than handing in the parchment, but wider than the refusal Tomas had expected. It asked him to be small, to be an honest thief who took only for survival and no spectacle. It put the onus back on him to choose whether he could live with a quiet bargain instead of a blaring sale. It was a dangerous mercy. She had no right to impose the risk, but it was the only way she could imagine protecting the creature. Tomas studied her then, the set of her jaw, the way her fingers kept the parchment safe, the rawness beneath her composure. He knew what it meant to carry a thing you had no right to trade. It corroded the edges of a man. For the first time, he felt the weight of a decision that was not purely arithmetic. He had to gamble not on cash, but on character. "You don't trust me," he said, not as challenge, but as a truth between them. "No," she said simply, "not yet." Out in the tree line, the Sasquatch shifted his bulk and huffed a breath that smelled of moss and thaw. He had listened to human bargaining before. He had learned the sounds that meant retreat and the ones that meant threat. He watched Tomas with a patience that had no haste because he had time measured in rings of fallen trunks. He watched to see whether the man approaching the crest of himself would be the kind to buy things for the price of others' pain. Tomas inhaled like a man who had swallowed something bitter and forced it down. He looked at his crew, ragged, hungry, human, and then at Mara, small in the doorway, defiant and fragile, the pact folded like a letter in her hands. The choice he would make was not simply about their route down the mountain. It was about what he intended to put into the world once he left it behind him. He could take the photograph, sell the story, and vanish with a pocket full of proof and a conscience he could hibernate like a venom. Or he could walk away, leave proof undiscovered, and let the mountain keep one of its names. He turned his face up toward the window where the fading sky bled into the pines. The men in his crew shifted, a ripple of expectation and apprehension. The Sasquatch made a sound that was almost like waiting. Mara, watching the man who had planned to use her, felt something like hope and fear braided together. She had taught herself not to believe in rescue, but sometimes rescues come in forms that are not easily classified. A man who chooses a strange small mercy, a creature who decides not to strike, a woman who keeps a promise by allowing human frailty a place to change. The mountain, patient as ever, let the moment stretch. It did not choose for them, but it had taught them the consequences of their choices. The next words would tilt the fragile balance. The next breath would steer the story toward ruin or the strange, slow healing that sometimes arrives when power is offered back instead of taken. The tremor of the forest settled like ash, but it did not mean calm. Tomas' eyes narrowed, and in them Mara could read the ledger being rewritten. He had always been good with numbers, debts repaid, routes calculated, men counted. But this was arithmetic with figures, the cost of a secret, the weight of a promise, the toll of a life traded for freedom. He looked at his men as if to measure how far their hunger would push him. Then he looked at Mara and the photograph, and something in him broke open in a new, dangerous way. "All right," he said finally, and the word had the quiet of a man deciding to do something small and unprecedented. "We leave the photograph. We leave the seeds." The room exhaled, an animal sound meant for survival. Some of his men snorted. Others stared as if a trick had been played on them. The crooked-nosed boy's mouth hung open. The larger one at the loft swore softly. Tomas' voice steadied only because he had to make it. "We take only the thermos and the blankets. We move at dusk, and we don't talk about this to anyone." Relief warred with suspicion inside Mara. The offer was both a reprieve and a wager. A man like Tomas could change his mind, could bargain again, could choose spectacle over mercy when the coin was right and his conscience asleep. She watched the muscles in his jaw work. The choice he had uttered could be the start of a new kind of violence, one that dressed itself as honor. Or it could be a surrender to something older than him, the truth that not everything was for sale. "You could still sell the story," she said, because words were what she had when hands were not enough. "You could still go to men in town with that photograph. You won't be the first to think of what it might fetch." Tomas's laugh was small. He looked at the photograph as though it were a wound. "People worth money are dangerous with proof," he answered. "People who buy proof like trophies will come up here with cameras and cages. I don't want that. Not for me. Not for anyone." The admission startled him. He hadn't meant to let pity sound like conviction. He had meant to use things. Instead, he found himself defending them. The younger bandit shifted, angered by restraints he hadn't agreed to. "We're wasting time," he muttered. "We ruin a house for blankets and coffee?" He was the kind of man for whom immediate profit was oxygen. The lack of a tangible ledger made him restless. "Listen to the boy," the large one at the loft said with a grin that showed a broken tooth. "We don't get choices like this often, Tomas. We do what we came to do. We take." "Not tonight," Tomas cut him off, and the authority in his voice was like the return of a tide. It did not belong to the cruelty that had opened the door, but to a new order he had not expected to govern himself. The man's grin faltered. The men were thieves, yes, but they were also human, and humans followed a leader who made firm, even surprising, decisions. Outside, the forest shifted as if to test the decree. The Sasquatch listened in a way that did not map neatly to human ears. He had no use for speeches, only for the behaviors that followed them. Tomas' choice would be measured in steps taken and things left untouched. The giant tilted his head and made a sound that ran along the border between relief and suspicion. He did not forgive, he only observed. He had learned not to mistake small mercies for absolution. Mara's body remained taut as a drawn bow. She wanted to believe. She needed to believe. But belief had been punished in her life by blizzards that took roots, by men who traded promises for absence, by neighbors who learned to forget the old rights. She folded the parchment tighter in her hand, feeling the ridges of the creases as if they were the lines of a palm. "If you leave," she said slowly, "you keep the secret. You never tell. You never speak of him to anyone who would bring nets or cameras. You keep the mountain to itself." Tomas met her gaze without flinching. "We leave it as we found it," he promised. "We talk about weather and goats. We talk about nothing that matters. We'll be ghosts down the ridge." The promise sounded like a prayer, because it had teeth against him. The crooked-nosed man spit on the floor. "And if we get hungry," he said, "how long's that promise last?" "As long as you live," Tomas said. There was no poetic flair in his answer. It was a commitment felled into the moment like an axe in wood. "We cross the pass. We sell enough of what we already have to eat. We never come back." They argued then in low voices. Fear and greed braided into bargaining. Tomas kept cutting them off, returning to the same strange thread. Leave it alone. A trade-off was being made, safety now for silence forever. The men finally subsided only because Tomas had the weight to enforce it, and because there was a sliver of future in the bargain that did not involve more blood. But bargains were brittle. The larger man's fingers hovered near the jar of seeds for longer than was polite. His breath fogged in the cabin, and his eyes flicked to the photograph again and again. The presence of law, invisible but plausible, held them like a leash. If they left and told, they'd risk the sheriff knocking at their doors. If they kept silent, they'd carry a secret that might starve them before it taught them the taste of restraint. "You think I won't think of it later?" the crooked-nosed man grumbled once Tomas had left the room for a smoke on the stoop. His voice was low with the predatory boredom of men who followed orders they disliked. He had to test the boundaries. That was what his nature demanded. "Then you'll be a different man," Mara said without looking at him. "You'll remember this night when you feel the need to sell something that isn't yours. And maybe," her voice caught, "maybe you'll regret it. Maybe you won't, and you'll have to live with that." The man laughed at her like at a child, but there was a hollow inside it. It pinned her to the truth she had always carried. People might change, or they might not. There was no guarantee in any bargain but the one you had to live with afterward. Tomas came back in, the smoke clinging to his coat. He stood by the door, a shadow cut against the daylight, and in his hand he held the thermos and one folded blanket. Tokens of a raid that had been tempered into a negotiation. He looked at Mara, and the look between them had shifted into something that was no longer merely transactional. There was an unasked question resting there. What if you choose not to take because you have learned to call another way of being valuable? "You trust me?" he asked, finally, without bravado. "No," she said again. "Trust is not what I have to give. Judgment is. I judge you by your actions. Leave now and keep your mouth closed, and you will be a different kind of thief. You will be someone who doesn't sell his name for coin." Her words were softer than the edges of her fear. They were a map he might follow if he wanted to. "If you break it, well, we'll hear you coming a long way off." The men gathered their things with the slow, disgruntled resignation of ex-cons finishing parole. They left with the thermos and a blanket, with a handful of petty loot and none of the proof that made the mountain vulnerable. Tomas lingered a long moment, looking out the broken doorway at the tree line where the Sasquatch watched his retreat like a slow, patient judge. Then, to Mara's surprise, he reached into his pocket and left something on the table. A small, folded note, not money, but a name and a promise he'd meant to write for someone else once. "If you need help," it read in shaky ink, "I know men who can move quietly. I can find you other passings. I can—" He stopped scribbling because the words were dangerous. "I can do this without telling." The paper was a frail thing, but the gesture meant more than the thermos or the blanket. It meant that the ledger in his mind had shifted value tables. He had decided to add a line item for human decency, even if small. The men descended the path like low thunder, boots pressing the trail into the shape of their leaving. The forest watched them go with the indifference of a thing that had outlived empires. The Sasquatch did not move from his tree until their shapes were swallowed by trunks. Then he padded forward and stopped near the doorstep, where Mara stood with parchment and photograph safe. He pressed a massive hand to the wood as if blessing it. Mara reached out and touched his palm. The skin was coarse as root, warm as river stones in sun. For a breath, the mountain's old peace came back like a tide. But the peace was not unbroken. Tomas had left a fissure the size of a human favor in the rock. The note on the table could become proof in a worse story. Men with better suits and worse intentions might read the ledger and decide the mountain was up for auction. The sheriff might still come. The crooked-nosed boy might think of his hunger on a night when guilt felt too heavy and tell someone in the wrong place. Mara tucked the photograph and the parchment away again, and the Sasquatch watched with his old, inscrutable patience. She had won an immediate battle, but the war of being forgotten and kept was ongoing. Choices had been made, and bones of trust had been laid like stepping stones across a river. They might hold, or they might shift. For tonight, the cabin hummed with a fragile safety and a wealth of small truths. That a man could stop, that a creature could spare blood, that a woman could bargain with ghosts and come back with a living promise. She sat by the stove when the men were gone, the heat a small planet around her. Her fingers traced the folds of the parchment and the edge of the photograph until the lines blurred. Outside, the forest spoke in the old language of wind and bark. The Sasquatch padded away slowly, melting into the pines like a secret. Mara watched him go with a grief that was already stitched to a strange new thread, an ache that tasted like hope and fear braided together. When the first deputy light came the following morning, not from the men who had left, but from a neighbor asking if the Hargrove place had been seen, Mara would have to face questions. There would be interviews and eyes that measured the thinness of solitude like a crime. But for now, the secrecy hummed in her veins like a living thing. She had kept the pact tonight. She had made a bargain with a stone of a man and with her own stubbornness. The fracture had been averted, but the secret had been cracked open a little, and in that crack, light and danger would find its way. The mountain did not forget easily, but it did remember. And in remembering, it taught. It taught that some promises require repeated defense, that mercy is a fragile currency, that love sometimes lives in keeping a thing whole by not showing it to the world. Mara folded the paper and the photograph once more, pressed them into the chest where her grandmother's shawl lay, and listened to the creak of the cabin settling like a body relieved. The world beyond the pines remained hungry and clever. The pact would need tending. The cracks would need watching. But for the first time in a long while, Mara let herself feel the space where terror had been loosened by a human choosing not to take. It did not feel like safety so much as a beginning, an odd, dangerous, hopeful start. The air in the cabin was thin as confession when Tomas closed the door behind his men and stayed. He did not leave like the others, retreating with their small prizes and resentments. He stood on the threshold with the dusk making his silhouette into a ledger of shadow and light. Mara watched him, fingers still smelling of ash and seed, and saw the calculation in him reshape into something that nearly looked like contrition. The pact between them had been bought in promises. Now it had to be sealed in an act. Outside, the Sasquatch waited under the old fir, eyes reflecting the last flare of day. He had been patient and terrifying in equal measure. He had been the mountain's answer to human trespass. Tomas had seen that answer, and, in the stillness after his men had gone, realized he owed the creature more than a photograph. He had come to the cabin a thief. He would leave it, if he left at all, with a different currency, his own vulnerability. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Tomas said finally, his voice low enough that the wood near his boots vibrated. "I'm asking you to let me prove I'm not what I was." He stepped fully into the room, as if the door had been a border he must cross to change. The thermos and the blanket sat like apologies on the table, but what he held in his palm was colder and sharper. A small gun, its metal winked with city ugliness. He put it down slowly, the move both symbolic and dangerous, and then pushed it toward the hearth with the care of a man who did not yet know how to be brave. "Take it outside. Break it. Do what you must. I can't make your world safe. I can only refuse to leave a mark." Mara watched the weapon slide on the wood and felt the mountain's muscles tighten through her like a remembered wind. She had thought his offer to spare the photograph was a mercy bought on the cheapest terms. But to place the gun before her was to ask for a new kind of surrender, the surrender of the weapon he had brought to enforce him. She had guarded against men who bargained with violence. She had never expected one to offer the symbol of that violence as an offering. "You think destroying the gun will keep the world from asking about him?" she asked, and her voice carried the dry skepticism of someone who had watched oaths turn into gossip. She stepped forward, then stopped when the Sasquatch's chest caught on the other side of the door and the giant made a sound like a branch's complaint. "No," Tomar said, "but it shows me." He searched her face like someone trying to find a map in a stranger's eyes. "It shows I can unlearn what I used to do. Maybe it's small, maybe it's nothing, but I can't give back the years I took from my own boy. I can't fix the ledger I kept with my child's absence, but I can leave a gun on a table and choose not to use it. It's an action I can own." Mara thought of his son, of the firefighter's helmet Tomas had once told a man outside a bar he'd bought, the lie that kept him alive in the city for a night. She thought of the room where promises had been swallowed, and the small human tragedies that had made him into a man who stole to survive. There was something dangerous and tender in his gesture. It reached toward a place inside her that had been hollow with solitude for years. The mountain had taught her the difference between words and stones. This was a stone in a world of words. She took the gun with gloves because ceremony had always mattered in these hills. The Sasquatch watched with an attention that had no impatience. He had observed humans watching themselves and had learned that sometimes the impossible was simply a decision repeated until it became habit. Mara carried the gun outside like a relic that belonged in the weather. The fur air bit at her skin. The sky had gone the color of dull coins. Tomas followed, not too close, respecting the small distance between protector and the thing protected. At the threshold, the Sasquatch moved forward. He accepted the gun as if auditioning its intent. He sniffed the metal and then turned his vast head toward Tomas, the mountain's oldest eyes resting on a man who had chosen a small act of restraint. There was an exchange then that had nothing to do with language, an ancient weighing of intention. Mara felt it as a pull at her sternum, the old pack's threads reading the new stitch. "Break it where the spring cold takes it," she heard herself say. "The river will swallow the pieces and not remember the shape." It was ritual and practicality braided into one. Tomas nodded and handed her a hatchet he'd taken from the loft, the same blunt instrument that had once been used to split cords of winter wood. His fingers brushed hers, and for a fragile second, the mountainside between them felt like something that could be crossed. When the hatchet rose, Tomas's hand did not tremble. His breath came in prisoned pulls, a man holding his own small reformation. He swung, and the gun split with a sound like a small failure. Metal flew, a few bright sparks catching the last of daylight. The Sasquatch inhaled and, smelling the iron and the man's intention, bowed his head slightly as if to mark the occasion. The gesture was nothing like gratitude and everything like recognition. They walked down the slope together, woman, man, guardian, toward the creek that braided the mountain in soft willows. The snowmelt had come early this year, and the water ran with a noise like pages. Tomas let the metal pieces go one by one. Each piece sank and forgot its gleam. Mara watched the river take it and felt her heartbeat slow, as if the mountain itself had unclenched. "Why did you stay?" she asked at last, the words caught between the rhythm of the water and the moss scent Tomas carried. "Because I thought I could take what I needed," he said. "Because the city taught me that taking solves things. And then I saw you, your stubbornness like a thing that had teeth, and I saw him watching. Something in me remembered a boy who loved a man who never came home. I didn't want to be the thing that broke myths into trophies." He stopped and rubbed his hands together, the confession tasting like cold. "I stayed because I wanted to know if I could be less monstrous than I used to be." Mara's eyes stung with more than mountain wind. She had been alone for so long that the idea of a man choosing to be smaller instead of larger felt scandalous and sacred all at once. The Sasquatch stood near them like a mountain monolith turned animate, and the sense that they had been witnessed by the ages made the moment heavier and kinder. "We have to keep watch," Mara said finally, the woman of duty resurfacing. "Not just tonight. The note you left might travel, a rumor has legs. My people, my grandmother's words, said that covenants are kept by work more than by spells. It will take tending." "I'll do it," Tomas said then, sudden and sharp, and the resolve in him was the kind that terrorizes and redeems in the same breath. "I'll come back when it's safe. I'll watch roads. I'll be the thing in the town that swallows secrets, not sells them. If men come asking, I will be first to lie. If they threaten you or the pact, I'll stand between them and you. I won't ask for payment. I pay my debt with silence and presence." The Sasquatch's breath fogged in the air like a blessing. Mara watched the man's face as if it were a map she had been given in a dream. Worn routes, fresh ink for roads not yet traversed. She did not know whether to trust him completely. She only knew she could measure his change, like checking for frost under a snow layer. He had offered not grand gestures, but work, a slow, visible recompense. "I do not ask for promises," she said quietly, "but I ask for this. When you leave, you do not make the mountain into a story for the small boys who salivate at the idea of trophies. You keep it the way my grandmother taught me, unspoken when it must be. You hold it like a secret girlfriend holds a lover's hand in the dark." He laughed, a small, honest sound. "I can do that," he said. "I will be a better thief, one who steals time from the things that would hurt you." They walked back toward the cabin, the pact between them wet and new as the creek stones. In the doorway, the Sasquatch placed a massive hand against the log as if blessing the shelter, and Mara reached up and touched his fingers. His skin was rough like bark and warm like the inside of a root. The contact stung with the intimacy of two very different protectors choosing to stand together. Tomas stood a pace behind her, and his hand hovered near the photograph on the table. He did not touch it. Instead, he drew a breath and, with an awkward kindness, bent and retrieved the folded note he'd left, then tucked it into his coat. It was private and practical, a promise he intended to keep. Outside, as night closed like a curtain, Tomas lit a small, careful fire at the edge of the path. He would not sleep in the cabin. That was part of the penance he had chosen. He would watch the trail like a man guarding a child's breath. Mara, in the warmth of her home, sat with the photograph and felt the edges of something like trust begin to fray open, not in surrender, but in possibility. The Sasquatch settled under the window, his shoulders a ridge under the stars. He watched the pair, two fragile human things learning a new transaction, sacrifice in place of possession. Mara leaned the photograph against her palm and imagined her grandmother smiling in the way of women who had lived by oaths. Tomas sat outside until the coals made red eyes in the dark, and in those embers a man reheated a life he wanted to claim back, not for himself, but for someone he could not name without guilt. When the deputies came the next morning, summoned by a neighbor's worry and not by the band's chatter, they found a cabin that had been ransacked and then carefully rearranged, as if someone had come through to measure what must remain. Tomas left before the deputies reached the ridge, moving down the pass with a gait that was not hurried but deliberate. He carried no trophies, only the memory of a night where he had chosen a strange tenderness over a darker profit. Mara watched him go from the loft window and felt the contract between them tighten into something neither legal nor ephemeral, a human vow sealed by a gun's ruin, a river swallowing, and a monster's patient judgment. The Sasquatch exhaled the mountain's slow approval, and Mara let herself hope, cautiously, like planting a seed in hard ground, that the cost of keeping the secret had been paid, at least for now. The morning settled like a benediction, thin sunlight knitting the roof's frost into lace, and the creek running with its patient, indiscriminate music. Mara watched Tomas's diminishing boots from the loft window until the trail swallowed him. He moved like a man practicing a new gait, less the hurried stealth of a thief, and more the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone learning to keep vigil. The Sasquatch remained where he had rested, a great dark silhouette against silver pines, his breath fogging and steady. He did not follow Tomas. That was not his place. He stayed with the cabin and its woman, an ancient promise kept in living muscle. Downstairs, Mara arranged the jars as if arranging a map, labels outward, seeds organized by the stories her grandmother had taught her. Ritual mattered. It reconfirmed duty, impressed continuity into the world. She wrapped the photograph in oilcloth and slid the brittle parchment into the chest beneath the bed. Each movement was slow and considered, as if the body could stitch memory into wood. The cabin smelled of spruce and the faint iron of the river. It smelled of survival. A neighbor stopped by mid-morning, breath bright with town concerns. He asked about noises and strangers. Mara answered with measured truths and intentional absences. She spoke of a break-in, of blankets taken, of a thermos gone, and she let the silence that held the rest be thick as stew. The deputy came later with polite questions and soft pens. Mara offered him coffee and the exact shape of what she would say, nothing that invited curiosity. She learned the art of lying like a prayer. At dusk, Tomas returned, not to stay, but to keep a promise. He approached with a slow patience, bringing a parcel of smoked meat and a length of rope for mending nets. He sat at the threshold like a penitent and left the gifts in the doorway, then backed away with the respect of a man who had learned his limits. Mara accepted the offerings with a nod that was both businesslike and intimate. No words were wasted. His presence was small, deliberate, and it fit into a new ledger, silent guardianship instead of sale. The Sasquatch watched them both from the fur line, and in his steady observation, something like approval gathered. He padded to the cairn where Mara's grandmother had taught children to leave first offerings and deposited a pine cone, an old creature's benediction in the only language he had. Mara saw it at dusk and felt the mountain breathe around her. The pact had been tested. It remained, altered but alive. Night folded the ridge. Mara slept in the loft with the photograph close and the parchment beneath her pillow. In the dark, she dreamed of small seeds pushed into yielding soil and of a man who had learned to hold his hunger at bay. The mountain kept its secrets a little longer, and in the hush between trees, a fragile trust grew, stitched quietly by the choices of a woman, a thief, and a guardian who would not be named in any museum. The last image that stayed with her as dawn pressed a pale coin through the pines was simple. A massive palm against the cabin's weathered wood, a touch that felt less like possession and more like a promise kept.